Like most of my projects these days, they begin with an ask from my wife. We had been collectively wanting to build a thin table that would sit behind our couch. The design of it would be a mix of steel and walnut, and we wanted it to have 2 shelves and a single drawer. The desire to incorporate more steel into our furniture stems from us currently feeling like our furniture and house just has too much wood in it. So this not only would be a fun project for me to build because I've really taken to welding, but it would also really look great and stand out properly in our house. It will also be the first piece of furniture you see when you enter through the front door. I designed a few simple pieces in SketchUp, and after quickly coming to an agreement on the final look, I got to work. The first step for this table was to build the entire frame from 1-inch steel tubing. This consisted of me making a cut list from my SketchUp file, marking out all of the various lengths, and using my metal chop saw to make the cuts. Before welding up any steel, each of the end surfaces will need to be cleaned up with an angle iron and a flap disc. Removing these burrs and adding a small chamfer allow for the weld to penetrate properly and the bond to be strong. I began welding up this project using my Power MIG 210, first starting with the 2 long sides of the table. I don't have a welding table, but I do have magnets and a flat piece of steel on top of my old outfeed table that works almost just as well. The key with welding without being able to clamp everything down is measuring before and after each weld to make sure things are all perpendicular and line up properly, as the heat can warp the metal just enough to throw off the project. And I must have had my settings off slightly because I was finding that at the beginning as I welded things up, I wasn't getting my best beads, and I think my feed rate was too much for the gauge of steel that I was using, so I quickly fixed that. After sorting through those issues, I could use the previously welded up layouts to make matching sides. And I think I'll buy a few more vise clamps in the future, as this was really helpful in making exact copies of the legs. This project was the biggest welding project I had tackled so far, and was a bit of trial and error to figure out how to tackle each step. I found myself welding up large sections at a time, then hitting all of the surfaces with the angle grinder to smooth out the welds, and then moving on to the next step to combine the larger pieces together. If you weld up too much in the beginning, it can become difficult to get to certain areas later on to clean up your welds, so just be aware of that. Once the main body was welded up, I began adding a few flat pieces of stock to the top that would later serve as a way to connect the wood shelves to the steel frame. And I cut these from leftover scrap 1x2 steel that I had, and I added a few large holes over at the drill press. Then I could tack in place with a few beads, hammered it into place to make sure it was flush with the top, and then finalize the weld. The drawer component of this piece was going to take up about half the width of the overall frame and only be about 4 inches tall. In order to make this look completely flush with the piece, I had to cut a lot of precise pieces with various 45-degree corners on it so that all of the welds would flush up and look like a continuous piece of steel. This was probably the most complicated portion of the build for me, as getting those pieces to line up and be even with limited tools and magnets is a little tricky. Plus, the plan for the front of the drawer was to have it sit recessed within this steel frame, so if it was out of square, it would look totally off. Eventually, after all the pieces were cut, welded up, and sanded down, the basic frame of the entire table is finished. And I'm not sure what's happening with the angle of this shot, but trust me when I say that all of the surfaces and angles and corners are even and square. And if you are interested in building something similar to this, I'll go ahead and put a link to the SketchUp file that you can download and access for free. The next thing I wanted to do for this steel framework was to add a solid piece of flat steel on each end of the drawer that would cover up the drawer slides and make the design just look a little cleaner. To do this, I marked out my measurements on a small sheet of 1/4 inch steel for each side, and then using my angle grinder and a diamond cutoff wheel, I first scored a line of where my cuts would be and then slowly cut off each piece. I then tacked those in place in a few places on the inside of the steel frame, and these didn't have to be super clean or even, as you never actually see them in the final piece. Last up for the framing was to add adjustable feet to the bottom. I marked out 4 squares on some more of that leftover flat steel I had and found the center of each one. Then I could drill large holes over at the drill press before cutting them up into 4 smaller squares. I found these cheap adjustable floor pieces at Home Depot as well as matching nuts for the screw type. I could screw on each floor piece and then tack the nuts into place once they were tight. Now that the nut had been secured to each of those individual squares, I could then weld that piece into the base of each leg, which would then allow me to insert each of those adjustable feet to help level off the overall framework, no matter what floor it was sitting on. Day 2 of this was pretty much straightforward in terms of the build. I needed a single shallow drawer. Using some leftover 1/2-inch plywood I had, I cut up all the pieces using a mix of my table saw and miter saw. Then with a mix of glue and brad nails, I could secure everything together, and I opted to not use screws as this just wasn't necessary for the size of the drawer and the amount of weight that it would eventually carry. The next step in this was a first for me, and I was a bit nervous about it. I wanted to blacken the steel using a patina that would help contrast with the walnut wood. Now, having never done this before, I'll just say that I'm in no way an expert in this, but can leave a more detailed video of this process in the description if you're interested. Now, I began this process by cleaning off all of the surfaces using a degreaser for steel. Once all those surfaces were clean, I used my random orbital sander and some 120 grit paper to sand down lightly all of the steel surfaces. By giving each of the surfaces a smooth surface with relatively the same texture, the patina is more likely to take to the piece evenly. The patina I'm using dilutes with water and can be applied with a brush or a spray bottle. I found a spray bottle to be the easiest for this project given all of the surfaces and corners that I had to hit. To apply it, you simply spray it in a ventilated area onto the work surface and allow it to sit for 3 to 5 minutes on the surface. After it does, you'll hose down the entire piece with water. Now the tricky part of this is that the water in the patina will actually begin to rust the steel, and I made the mistake of using my leaf blower and some regular air instead of heat or acetone to remove that excess water, and I had to deal with a bit of surface rust each time. The way around this would be to use a blowtorch quickly to evaporate all the water. Now for darker results, just repeat this process until you're satisfied. I did it twice. And for some reason I forgot to film it, but the next step involved me attaching the drawer slides to the steel framework and then the drawer to the drawer slides. And you can actually see some of that surface rust I was talking about after the second time that I eventually removed using a wire brush. Next up was the woodworking portion of the build. The top and bottom shelves and the drawer front would all be walnut. I bought rough lumber, which required me to break things down on the miter saw and then joint edges before gluing up. And if you don't have a joiner, you can just purchase pre-milled lumber. The top shelf was to be about 10 inches wide, so I needed to glue 2 pieces together to make that width. And I find using cauls whenever possible helps create a really flat glue up. While that cured, I could mill up the bottom shelf over at the table saw. This one needed to be really precise as it would sit in between the steel frame instead of on top like the top shelf, and I made it slightly smaller than that overall framework to account for expansion in the hotter months. One thing I wanted to do on the framing was weld in small pieces that would allow me to secure the bottom shelf to the frame. And I waited to do this because I wasn't sure of the exact thickness of the material that I'd be using, so I waited until I knew that. Now that I knew how thick the piece would be, I could then weld each of those pieces into place so that the bottom shelf could sit on top of it and be secured from underneath. The walnut of the top shelf did have a few holes in it, so before finalizing the piece, I mixed up some epoxy with black pigmentation and filled in those voids. And I really like how black epoxy looks against walnut when used really subtly. After letting the glue dry and the epoxy cure, I could mill up the shelves using a combination of my planer and table saw to their final size. While I was doing this, I also finalized the size of the recessed drawer front and did some final sanding on all the surfaces up to 120 grit in preparation for finish, including breaking all of the sharp edges. For finish, I just used a semi-gloss polyurethane and I did 3 total coats, sanding between each one until I had a nice, smooth, even coverage. Before final assembly, I needed to add my drawer pull. We chose this matte black drawer front that you can get at Home Depot for about $4. We liked the look of it, but wanted it to match the darkened, rusted look of the steel a bit more, so we hit it with a wire brush from my drill to scuff it up. The next step was as straightforward as finding the center of the drawer front, marking out the location for the screws, pre-drilling holes for the pull from the rear, as well as creating a recess for the screws, and then attaching the drawer pull to the walnut. A little bit of hand tightening finished off the front, and I was happy with how the wire brush look came out ultimately. To place the drawer front, I did the card trick where you fit as many cards on one side as possible, then divide it in half so that the drawer pull sits evenly between the top and bottom and the left and right sides. It was here where I pleasantly discovered that my welds were, in fact, square and even. The drawer was then attached using 2 screws from the inside of the drawer, hidden from sight when the drawer was closed. Also, I'll link to these drawer slides that I used in the description. They were only about 9 inches long, which you can't get at big box stores, but they were cheap from Amazon and they work great. The last thing to do was then attach the bottom and top shelf using a few shallow screws with washers to allow for wood movement. And then the piece was done. We really like how this came out. It's clean, it's really high quality in my opinion, and the walnut and darkened steel look great against each other. Could the blackening be a bit better? Totally, and I'll do better next time. But overall, the final piece is really clean, it looks really awesome, and serves a host of helpful organization and storage functions in our living room. I appreciate you all sticking around from this video, and I look forward to sharing my next project very soon. Bye!